If you've been hitting long runs and cardio sessions hoping to get leaner, but you aren't seeing the fat loss results you want, this episode is definitely for you. Former pro triathlete and Olympic coach Brad Kearns reveals how chronic cardio may be sabotaging your metabolism and making fat loss harder. You'll discover why walking could give you far better results than running, learn about how running impacts your appetite and hormones, and understand exactly how to optimize your movement for both physique and longevity. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that helps you build a strong, healthy physique using evidence, engineering, and efficiency. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today we're challenging conventional wisdom about cardio and fat loss with Brad Kearns. Brad is a researcher, coach, former two-time U.S. national champion, number 3 world-ranked professional triathlete. He placed second in last year's USA Masters National Championships in the 55 to 59 high jump. His new book, Born to Walk with Mark Sisson, exposes the science behind why extensive walking, not running, aligns with our genetic blueprint for optimal health. Today, you'll learn the metabolic reasons running can make fat loss harder, how it might make you lazier, and tips for a more effective approach to cardio for fat loss. Brad, thank you so much. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Philip, I'm glad to be on. Great intro there. Thanks for spending the time. And yeah, we're going to roll up our sleeves and get into it because we got some issues to discuss in the fitness world. And it's been decades now of this programming message of struggling and suffering your way to getting fit, that this is the path. And it's time to unwind it because so many well-meaning people have, laced up their running shoes, and in the case of what we focus on in the book, but also, devoted gym rats who are going in and taking a bunch of classes or immersed into the extreme CrossFit community, and by and large, following an inappropriate protocol that leads to breakdown, burnout, illness, and injury, and especially failed efforts at reducing excess body fat and all kinds of other fallout where the body is, trained inappropriately and the results don't happen.
So let's go right for the jugular because you took us there. And you mentioned some trigger words for people, I'm sure, including CrossFit, which I did for like 8 years before I switched the way that I train. What's wrong with running, Brad? Like, what is wrong with it?
Well, it depends who you are. And it's really a wonderful outlet for people who are highly trained and well adapted and have that baseline physical fitness and musculoskeletal resiliency to enjoy endurance training. But it can easily lead to problems when you are not well adapted and you're coming from sedentary lifestyle patterns and then lacing up the shoes and heading down the road. So we need to look at running as a very dangerous, high risk sport because of the aforementioned fallout that I talked about. I talked to earnest high school kids who are competitive runners, and then they get injured, and their parent seeks me out to talk about my experience as a former elite level high school and college runner and pro triathlete. And I say, you understand, like, it's probably the second most dangerous sport on the high school docket besides tackle football. And it's this pounding and this prevailing approach where the obsession with repeatedly accumulating lots of miles day after day in the interest of getting fit for these ridiculous events that we glorify, like the 26.2 mile marathon. So it's inherently too stressful for the body and for most participants to gain any benefit from. Therefore, we have that tongue-in-cheek title of the book. We call it Born to Walk, and it's a little bit of a take on the 2009 best-selling book called Born to Run, which glorified the amazing genetic attributes of the human for endurance. So we are indeed built for occasional magnificent feats of endurance as we are hunting down our prey on the savannah and evolving to the top of the food chain because we were able to access the big game and the nutrient-rich foods. And so that's part of our evolutionary biology, that we are, for example, bipedal. So we are much better runners than a four-legged creature. And we have sweat mechanisms, so we can persist and do endurance achievements in the heat where other animals might become overheated. We have an Achilles tendon, which primatologist Bill Sellers contends is, quote, the primary evolutionary adaptation that made human beings who they are. Because our ape cousins who don't have Achilles tendons, if you go to the zoo and watch a chimpanzee decide to sprint across his area, he's running with this strange flat-footed style like a gorilla. and they're not well adapted for running any distance. And so we take this story and this message, and then we have a very flawed misinterpretation and misappropriation to conclude that we are going to benefit from running long distances on the regular. So what happens when we get into overly stressful workout patterns, and I'll define exactly how you can determine whether you're in an overly stressed pattern or not. But when we overstress ourselves with regular workouts that are slightly to significantly too difficult, that's when we incur these overuse injuries at an amazing rate. The stats on the running community are absolutely shocking and embarrassing. Yale University School of Medicine contends that 50% of all regular runners are injured every year, and that 25% of all devoted runners are injured at any given time.
Yeah, I was going to get into that stat. So I'm glad you led with that, because two major things you brought up. One is the injury rate. I know soccer's another one that's way up there on the injury rate, which involves a lot of running, but of course involves people crashing each other without equipment on. And I know lifting weights is at the bottom, if not the bottom lowest injury on the list, just so people are aware of that. You also mentioned the genetic or ancestral factor. Let's just talk about that for a second, because you made a great argument that it is not a red herring. What's the logical flaw when people say, well, if our ancestors did this one thing, then it extrapolates to everything else, which we do for food too. Let's admit it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you lead with sentences like, wouldn't you think that blank, blank, blank? And I'm like, well, maybe not. But since you loaded me up, I guess I have to think that way. Yeah. So I guess it's out of context evolutionary biology insight. So indeed, if we went and looked at the Hadza in Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, they cover between 3 and 9 miles per day in the course of their daily business gathering or out on persistence hunts. And so the human has long been engaged in frequent everyday movement until only actually recent times. When you think of the Industrial Revolution, before that, we were mostly farming and moving on our feet. And even in factory life, people were working hard. That's why we have 3 meals a day, because you have to fuel up at breakfast to go and bust your butt in the factory. You got to take a midday break because you've been working so hard. And then you come home and you want more food. And we still have 3 meals a day for people that sit in front of a screen all day. So modern life is so different that we really can't compare to some hunter-gatherer anecdote and contend that we too can engage in persistence hunting day after day. And in fact, the ancestral pattern was completely different than what we perceive it to be. Because if we were to fail at persistence hunting, we would be someone else's dinner. So we did not chase after the antelope for hours and hours and finally prevail because it got too hot. But we did that once in a while, and then we carried the game back to camp and we celebrated and feasted for a long time. And hunter-gatherers, by definition, did the bare minimum physical activity necessary to survive. Whereas today, we have a tendency to over-exercise, especially in the running and the fitness communities, where we push ourselves so hard. Because of all the confines and the comfort and predictability of modern life, we feel compelled to push and challenge our bodies. And that stuff is all great, and it's a great way to live a balanced, adventurous, active life. However, the problem occurs when you overdo it and compromise your health, compromise your fat loss goals, and get into these ruts where we see as a common pattern in the fitness scene.
Yeah, perfect segue to talk about metabolism, expenditure. There's a few concepts here that overlap we can maybe get into. When you talk about the Hadza, first of all, what came to mind is how much honey they eat. I remember watching the documentary about that.
Love it. Yeah.
It's pretty cool. But the idea of, for example, the constrained versus the additive model of expenditure, you're familiar with Henry Ponser's work on that and the doubly labeled water study. And then the fact that people overexercise. I mean, that is a key pillar we address on this podcast all the time, is a lot of people are doing too much and not enough of the right thing. And in my own nutrition coaching practice, plenty a person, especially women, but I don't want to stereotype because men too, will come in, just they're doing too much. And then you step back, you strip it out, you focus on lifting heavy and walking, and all of a sudden, so many things start to normalize. So how does this chronic cardio affect your metabolism, your ability to burn fat? And then we can lead to what are the alternatives?
Right. This constrained model of exercise asserts that we engage in an assortment of compensatory behaviors when we expend an excessive amount of energy exercising. I think it was Dr. Herman Pontzer's quote where he said, reproduction, repair, growth, and locomotion are a zero-sum game. So locomotion means all manner of movement and workouts and your workout patterns. And then if we dedicate too much energy to locomotion, we turn down these important dials of repair, reproduction, and growth. So that means the compensation theory of exercise means if you wake up your alarm at 6 a.m. and go slam a spinning class or run 8 miles in the freezing cold winter temperatures in Connecticut, the rest of the day, your body is going to conserve energy because you expended so much with the workout, especially if the pace was incorrect. And we'll get into that shortly. But it also means that this exhausting, depleting exercise pattern that many fitness enthusiasts are engaged in will dysregulate appetite and satiety hormones. So the 6 a.m. spin class is paired directly with reaching for the pint of Ben and Jerry's in the evening and wolfing the whole thing down. The body does not like to be depleted and exhausted on a regular basis, and we kick into these survival mechanisms that prompt us to overeat as if the brain is telling the body, well, I better finish this whole pint in case this fool tries again tomorrow morning to wake up at 6 a.m. and burn 750 calories at spin class. So that's the constrained model of energy expenditures. We turn down other dials. And the additive model, like you mentioned, is this long, flawed notion where you can go on the internet and calculate your basal metabolic rate and then go determine that a spin class burns between 650 and 700 calories, and then add that up. And as the calculation finishes here, you should lose 42 pounds of excess body fat in 1 year because you're doing spin class 3 days a week. And obviously, we've learned that that's a disastrous, dismal failure. But to continue on this rant, to answer your question, what happens when you engage in overly stressful endurance exercise patterns is that you chronically overproduce stress hormones, and they linger in your bloodstream just like they do in our hectic, high-stress modern life. So we already have stressful lifestyle patterns that are in disconnect with our ancestral model and our genetic expectation for health. And now you layer on top that 6 a.m. spin class or that long distance run and that 30 miles a week that you're trying to hit, and then work it up to 40 miles a week before the marathon comes in the final months. And what happens is it's stress on top of more stress. And when you put out too much cortisol, people are familiar with that term as the preeminent stress hormone. When you do that routinely, your body gets the signals, the genetic signals are sent to add body fat and shed lean muscle mass. And in particular, you are prompted to store visceral fat. That's the health destructive fat that collects around the organs, even worse than the subcutaneous fat, which is stored all over in your problem areas and is largely, it's not a big health concern, but the visceral fat has immediate destructive effects to your overall health and your hormone balance. And this is what happens to endurance freaks that train too hard and push their bodies without that balance of stress and rest, and also a more varied fitness program where, like you say, you're doing the low risk activities like lifting weights are far more safe than just jogging down the road with your elevated cushioned shoes.
And I want to put a pin in a topic to get to later if we don't forget, because I do want to address the corner case of the person who can do a high level of endurance activity and balance things out. I want to talk about that. But in the meantime, a few things just to clarify for folks listening, because you put that so clearly, is if you're trying to burn an extra 100 calories from more activity, you're probably going to offset a fraction of that, if not the whole thing, through this compensatory mechanism.
Yeah, Philip, when I worked for Spinning Company, you know, the spinning indoor cycling program, my friend Johnny G invented spinning, and we were, trying to educate consumers about different things. And so we actually funded a study to see what the calorie burning was like. And a spin class burns around 650 to 700 calories in that 45-minute class. And then I did a macronutrient analysis of a Jamba Juice medium smoothie and a breakfast scone, and it was like 710. So you're going at 6 a.m. If you do a spin class, you're going to be tending to reaching for that extra food to replenish depleted glycogen.
Yeah. And guess what? If you're tracking and you use willpower or discipline to not do that, then you're just going to be starving. So it's just either way, right? It all works out one way or the other. And this is why I like treating the body as a closed system, because you mentioned BMR calculators and people know the pie charts that have BMR, thermic effect of food, exercise and non-exercise. And they try to like add it all together. And really what you should do is, okay, this is what I'm eating. This is how my weight is changing. Therefore, I know how many calories I'm burning. And that's effectively what Ponser and the guys did, is they said almost everybody on the planet has roughly the same BMR when normalized for muscle mass, when normalized for body composition. And so that's not going to be an efficient way to burn more calories. And I know we're going to get to one that is, that everybody knows we're going to talk about, which is walking.
On that note, I came up with some interesting research in the course of writing this book, which was really fascinating. Someone who is sedentary and unfit, the sitting is the new smoking body of research. But what's happening there is that they are engaging overactive inflammatory processes and stress reactivity, end quote. I'm remembering this burned into my brain. So they are burning energy in an inappropriate manner. And the analogy that was brought up was like the firefighters are in the station and they're not getting any calls on the truck. And so they're racing up and down the stairs, and then they're coming over to your house just for practice. And so they bash in your front door and they run up around, and they also put an axe into your stairway. And then they go back to the station and rest and then do it to someone else's house. So we don't want these overactive inflammatory processes and stress reactivity, but that's what's happening if you do insufficient exercise and don't burn the calories in the correct manner through extensive everyday walking and dedicating yourself to an appropriately designed fitness program. And that's, again, because you mentioned the ceiling, it made me think of that. They're like, wait a second, how is my unfit, lazy neighbor burning the same number of calories per day as I am when I'm going to these 6 a.m. spinning classes? Some of it is devoted to the body not working right.
Yeah, it is fascinating when you look at walking versus standing and not being sedentary versus cardio versus lifting. And when you kind of combine the best of those, I was just talking to my coach the other day about having better work capacity and conditioning when you're a lifter. Are there benefits to that from a nutrient partitioning perspective? And there is evidence that shows that, if you're trying to build muscle, for example, and you're in a calorie surplus, a little bit more of that will go toward muscle if you're a little bit better conditioned. It doesn't mean doing a bunch of cardio. It just shows how like we're kind of meant to be fit people, doing things.
Yeah. And also, you're probably familiar with Chris Hinshaw. He's a big coach in the CrossFit scene. His business is called Aerobic Capacity, and he's a former compatriot of mine on the professional triathlon circuit. So we both had that extreme endurance background. Now, transformed into, he's a big CrossFit guy, and I'm a sprinter and a high jumper in masters track and field. But he was discovering when he started working with the CrossFit athletes that these guys are so powerful and explosive and have the amazing ability to do 10 box jumps and then climb the rope and then do some upside down handstand push-ups. However, with a lack of that baseline endurance or that baseline aerobic capacity, they're going to do this amazingly impressive workout and bomb out in 17 minutes instead of 31. And they're going to get eliminated in the CrossFit Games regionals instead of going to the finals. So every athlete in every sport, obviously the elite soccer players and the NBA players who are running up and down the court, everyone needs this aerobic foundation in order to thrive and perform even in the most explosive events. A power lifter, okay, the most explosive sport of all, where your effort is 4 seconds long. The longest thing they're asking you to do is lift the weight off the ground. But how long do these guys' workouts last? They last for hours. They do a 2.5-hour weightlifting session. So as soon as you get out of the car and walk through the parking lot to the front door of the gym and beep your pass and get your towel and head over to the weights and do a warm-up set and then sit and go through your text messages, which apparently is part of gym culture these days. And I often wonder, because I'm not a big gym guy, Philip, but I'm like, I see a guy on the bench press machine that I want to use, but he's resting between sets and sending text messages. Is it okay to say, hey, can you text like one bench over so I can do my one set and move on with my life?
It is okay. It is okay. It's gym etiquette to say, can I work in there? Yeah. He should tell him he should pace around, get some steps.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm making the point, it's like, as soon as you get out of your car, your heart rate is at least double resting rate and spiking up even higher when you're doing sets. But when you're sitting on the bench texting, it's still double resting rate. So you are getting a cardiovascular training effect for that entire hour and 45 minutes that you're goofing around in the gym in between doing hard stuff. And so that counts toward your cardio quotient to the extent that you don't have to go and pound out miles on the road to hit that checkbox on your total fitness scoreboard.
Yeah, that's right. Because again, I used to do CrossFit and you get conditioned, but you also burn out. And if you look at the competitors, they also focus a lot on their strength and their exercise, their movements to where they have a strength base as well, such that the cardio, the conditioning for them isn't as taxing, as someone else.
Right.
But okay, so this is another good segue because you talked about stress and the stress hormone cortisol, visceral fat, but you mentioned something specific. You said it can break down muscle tissue, I believe, which means it's catabolic. And people love to understand or don't always understand that concept of anabolic behaviors, eating anabolically, having higher energy flux, like through walking, that it's anabolic, recovering is anabolic, hormones are anabolic, but catabolic is the opposite. I don't know where you stand on carbs. This is just a side tangent, but I often talk about how sometimes carbs can be anti-catabolic when you're building muscle. But anyway, that's a separate topic.
Well said. Exactly.
Yeah. So I know you said walking is anabolic and running's catabolic. So maybe explain that a little more for folks.
Oh my goodness. That's so funny you bring up this because Mark and I spent probably a week talking back and forth to add a couple paragraphs to the book to explain it properly.
Okay.
And it's so complex, but we want to give you the simple insights. But just as a background, like body it's an oversimplification to say this is catabolic, this is anabolic, but it makes the point really well. But at all times, the body's undergoing processes that are both actually. And the best example is sleep. So sleep is called an amphibolic process because you are both engaging in catabolism as well as, of course, anabolic when you talk about, restoring and repairing and regenerating with your overnight sleep. So with walking, it is sending signals to the body for anabolic processes because it's minimally destructive. You have minimal impact trauma and you're getting all these processes working where you're getting more blood flowing, oxygen delivery. You're building a brain-derived neurotropic factor to help with neuroplasticity. So all this great stuff is happening with minimal penalty or destruction or breakdown. Now with running, overall, for most runners, because they are not fit enough to really do the sport in a manner that is minimally stressful and building the aerobic system, they're just breaking down the body over and over with a slightly too stressful pace and also incorrect form that's resulting in more impact trauma because what we see this pattern is the overstriding, breaking, jarring, heel striking pattern as seen in 80 to 95% of all recreational runners, according to Dr. Daniel Lieberman's research at Harvard. And so the reason that we see so much of this overstriding breaking pattern are people that are poorly adapted, have insufficient overall physical competency and musculoskeletal resiliency to run with correct form. Why are they running or how are they able to run? It was the invention of the elevated cushion shoe back in the 1970s by Nike. So these shoes came out where you could put on the shoe and shuffle down the street with this heel striking pattern and go and run 5 miles, whereby if you didn't have these magical shoes, you'd be traumatized after 2 minutes or 3 minutes and your calves and your feet would hurt because of the poor running form. So the shoes enable poorly adapted people to run who should not be running in the first place. Do they cause poor form? Of course not. It's an innate object that sits on a shelf. And so what they do is enable poor form. What's the cause of poor running form? It's that lack of basic physical fitness. So you have tight hip flexors, you have tight hamstrings, you have dysfunctional glutes because they don't fire because your form is incorrect. You have poor core strength and poor foundation so that you have an insufficient forward lean of the trunk. So you're allowed to do this breaking stride. You have poor ankle mobility and all these factors against you because you're not a super fit person and you have a lot of sedentary patterns in life. And then you insist on shuffling down the road at this dangerous sport that is going to drive chronic overuse injury.
Because it's so easy, right? You just lace up your shoes, no equipment needed, and you just go. Yeah, so I know the shoes in the 70s, and I believe there was some book in the 70s too that, I don't know if you know which one it is, that led to the fitness revolution or whatever, what came to running.
Oh, yeah, it's a great story. And we spend
Yeah.
a lot of time in the book talking about how this running boom kicked off. And it's important to understand because there's been so much hype and marketing commentary socializing us to think that running is this end all fitness accomplishment when in fact it's, mainly catabolic and prompts accumulation of fat rather than reduction of fat and prompts the loss of muscle. And boy, we really got into this mess with profit driven corporate marketing forces with a big interest in it, especially the running shoe advertising. Just Do It is widely regarded as the greatest advertising campaign of all time. And so, hey, how can you resist? And I want to clarify that, like, getting people off the couch in comfortable modern life and out doing something is a great step forward for mankind. But it's really important to do it correctly. Otherwise, we can actually be worse off than someone who just engages in a basic level of activity like tending to their garden and walking down to the post office to mail a letter and all those quaint memories that we have from a previous time before the fitness boom kicked into gear.
Yeah. So we addressed some of the reasons why running is not great for fat loss. Not only that it, breaks down muscle tissue, but you also compensate for the calorie burn. It also causes overtraining, which means you're not going to be, moving as much or you're going to impede recovery. But just to make it super clear for people, I know there's this idea running makes you tone, it burns fat. It's just part of that culture. Why is just that not the case? Just so people know, like the big bullet points behind that.
Well, it's not a very demanding sport for the overall musculoskeletal system, right? You're just shuffling down the road. Go look at the elite runners in the Olympics. These guys are super skinny and somewhat emaciated, but they're also ripped and they're fine athletes and they're running at a very, very high speed. So it's sort of like a different deal when you look at a guy who's running a 2 hour marathon or running the 10K around the track in 26 minutes. They're extremely highly trained athletes and very fit and have the physique of a champion. So the recreational aspect where people are running very, very slowly, however, they're still stressing their bodies too much with the simple act of running that they're not adapted to do. So it's kind of like pushing yourself to do a bunch of deadlifts or squats with really crappy form and continuing and insisting to continue and do more and more sets until you're really tired and your form's even worse. And then you get injured and exhausted and reach for the Ben and Jerry's. We wouldn't dream of doing that stupid of a workout in the gym. But basically, that's what we're seeing every day when people are going for that weekly mileage goal with that poor form, with that excess impact trauma and the overeating and the appetite and satiety dysregulation that occurs from overly stressful pattern. And one thing, when you listed off those reasons that we're criticizing running, we forgot another huge one, which is if you're devoting all this energy to cardiovascular endurance training at a slightly to significantly too stressful of a pace, guess what you don't have time and energy for anymore? You don't have time to even dabble in weights and go do one set through the machines once a week or the very bare minimum necessary to maintain functional muscle mass and muscle strength, and forget about probably the greatest return on investment of any workout known to mankind, which is sprinting, right? So the brief, explosive, all-out sprints are the thing that we lose more quickly with aging than we do the cardiovascular endurance. I talked to my mom about this. She's 87. She's in fantastic shape, and she walks 1 to 2 miles every morning with her dog. And she's very proud of it and looks around at people her age who are falling apart. And I say, hey, that walk is great. That's a great foundation. Now you need to keep that appointment with the personal trainer at the gym, and you need to go put your body under resistance load to maintain that muscle mass. It's absolutely essential. And I think, it's nice to see now with the content you putting out and many other people, like strength training and sprinting are vastly more important than this baseline cardiovascular steady state endurance training, because as I mentioned, you are getting cardio if you become a competent strength trainer or a sprinter.
Okay, so you open the door to sprinting because I wasn't even going to go there. I was next going to say, okay, so we know pretty much for a fact that you could lose fat, be fit, not have to run ever. Trust me, I know from personal experience and coaching many, many clients who don't want to run and they don't have to run. But sprinting is its own form of running in its own category. And I will say, I love it. I don't do it as often as I used to. Again, in CrossFit, my favorite thing to do was shuttle runs. I love the ones where every minute on the minute where you had to do like, I don't know, I think it was 10 meters. And then on the second minute, you do 10 meters and then 10 meters back. And then on the third, you add another segment. You see if you can get up to like 18 was a pretty good, like,
Wow.
I have an ego. I'm satisfying my ego, right? When we get to like 18. But let's dive into that then, because I don't talk about that enough on the show. I'm not against it. I talk about things like pushing and pulling sleds. We talk about if you need to go on the bike or do some swimming or something that is completely concentric without the eccentric loading. That's cool, for a session here or there. But tell us about sprinting.
Well, if we had more space on the cover, the book would appropriately be titled Humans Are Born to Walk and Sprint.
Okay.
And so that is our essential genetic expectation for health and survival, is that we need to be prepared. In primal times, we needed to run for our lives or run to get food so we didn't starve. And so that selection pressure, the genetic adaptations occurred where we became great endurance machines, as discussed earlier. And we also became very strong and we became powerful and explosive to deal with primal hazards. So we want to honor those genetic expectations for health today. And sprinting is a hugely important piece of the puzzle. Interestingly, it doesn't take that much time. So it's not a huge ask to have someone sprinkle in some sprinting stimulation into their fitness regimen. And we're talking about, when we really use the term sprint properly, we're talking about a brief, explosive, nearly all-out effort. And we know from exercise physiology, the human can only deliver a maximum effort for 7 seconds, right? That's the ATP, creatine phosphate, the energy inside the cell where you can go full bore, starts to peter out at 7 seconds. And so anything over 7 seconds is not technically a pure sprint. So when we watch the 100 meters in the Olympics and the guys run 9.79, they're actually decelerating a bit in the final stages of even the fastest, most explosive event in the Olympics. So that's something to understand when we talk about sprinting. The ideal template for a workout would be to sprint for 10 to 20 seconds. Yes, sprinting for 7 seconds is great, but if we get 10 to 20 seconds, then we're getting some good fitness stimulation, but we're stopping before we incur too much cellular stress and musculoskeletal trauma and stress hormone production because the workout's too brutal and your tongue's hanging out at the end. So a proper sprint workout is not Rocky Balboa puking on the side of the road from going so fast so many times. It's a very crisp, explosive session where you are executing precise technique and you do not degrade over the course of the workout. So unlike high intensity interval training where you're hanging on and you got 2 more and you can do it and the group is rallying around you and you high five at the end as you're dripping in a pool of sweat during that spin class where you're asked to go over and over again for 30-second sprints with 30 seconds rest and we're going to go for it. That's one form of training, but true sprinting is an extensive amount of rest in between very brief bursts of all-out performance. So I give this recommended template for anyone could be 4 to 8 sprints lasting between 10 and 20 seconds with a minimum 6-to-1 recovery to work ratio. So if you're sprinting for 10 seconds, you rest for at least a minute before you do another sprint. And that gives you this consistent quality of high performance effort with each rep. You only have to do 4 to 8. Oh, question in the back of the class. What if I get really good and fit and I do 8 good ones? Then what you're going to do is you're going to go faster. You're not going to go up to 12 someday or 14 or keep adding volume as we've been socialized to believe inaccurately by fitness programming where it's like more, more, more. With sprinting, it's all about quality and extensive rest. And as you read on my bio, now that I'm a master sprinter and having to learn all the attributes of sprinting that weren't familiar to me as a longtime endurance athlete, I'm getting scolded by my advisors because I'm only taking a 6-to-1 ratio, which I feel is plenty for me. But to get fast at 10-second sprints, you might want to rest for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes before you do another one. And that's just a more sophisticated level of sprint training. But for the basic template for everybody is that 4 to 8 sprints, 10 to 20 seconds, 6-to-1 ratio. And then you're opening up a whole new world of fitness benefits, especially, and probably of most interest to people, is the ability to shed excess body fat quickly, especially visceral fat. And there's great research showing that sprinting targets visceral fat reduction in particular. because visceral fat is more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat. So it makes it easier to remove if you send the right genetic signals through things like sprinting, or I guess you could arguably throw in fasting and things like that are, trying to rev up the metabolism.
I have to say, Brad, you've got the bug in me. All right. So I got to do this now. Because you're right. Like the way I used to do it was more of the HIIT style that you're talking about. And I absolutely love this prescription, and the caution to only go up in intensity, only go up in speed as your form of progressive overload for your sprinting is really good, because then people aren't doing, oh, now I'm doing 12 of these. Now I'm doing 20. Guess what? My Brad Kearns protocol is now an hour long. It doesn't work that way. This is good. I'm going to follow up on this with you later, and then this could be a whole separate topic to dive into. All right, cool. Sprinting, Brad. Good. Everybody has that.
Oh, yeah. Sprinting is definitely a full show dedicated to that. And when we look at these research benefits like brain-derived neurotropic factor and just making you a more confident, resilient person, and also what sprinting does is it reduces perceived exertion at all lower levels of exercise intensity. So if you become competent at sprinting, your 5-mile jog or your hour-long group exercise class in the gym, everything feels easier. And it literally is easier because, as you know from like central governor theory, your perception of how difficult the workout is how difficult the workout is. And so when we say, my quads got really tired on my 12th rep of squats, it's not literally true. The quads don't have feelings and emotions and think they're tired. It's your brain that gets tired because you never worked that top end. And so everything becomes sort of a challenge or grueling or all these sensations where we need to teach the body to perform that brief, explosive, powerful as the essence of anti-aging. So the anti-aging benefits are tremendous. And in contrast to that chronic overproduction of stress hormones that I talk about with an endurance training regimen, what sprinting does is an appropriately brief fight or flight spike of hormones into the bloodstream. And then because the workout is over quickly, you're able to quickly recalibrate back to homeostasis and come back stronger and more resilient thanks to testosterone and growth hormone coursing through your bloodstream, acting upon target organs, building more muscle, shedding excess body fat, and improving the brain's perception of fatigue during exercise.
Yeah, the mind-body thing is really powerful there. You mentioned, this reminds me a lot of just the system we use for lifting, right? It's the ATP-CP system. And if you look at the physique of sprinters, you know that they're not emaciated like long distance runners.
Yeah. We have there's a popular quip when we're doing live lectures and you ask, have you ever seen a fat sprinter?
Yeah.
And the answer is no. There's no such thing because it's the penalty for carrying excess body fat when you're going at high speed is so severe that the genetic signaling will occur every time you do a sprint workout to shed that excess body fat to adapt and become stronger for next time. Now, have you ever seen a fat marathon runner? In fact, the research from Cape Town Marathon in South Africa determined that 30% of the participants were over the healthy BMI range. And then we compare contrast to World Health Organization research showing that 30% of the global population, largely in the developed nations, is also outside of healthy BMI range. So when you go to an event and you cannot distinguish between the spectators and the participants, you got a problem with your sport. You go to a powerlifting meet, I can see who's competing in the heavyweight division and who's watching, but the marathoning generally does not support any improvement in physique and can actually cause extreme harm with that accumulation of visceral fat and the loss of muscle mass.
Yeah, and I know when I've sprinted and I've asked people to just do it randomly, who are lifters, who squat a lot, it's like that base of power goes a long way as well. They're a duo, they're like Batman and Robin there.
It's cool. Yeah.
It's pretty cool. All right. So on the other side of the spectrum, you posted something on Instagram just recently, a few days ago, that said endurance running the way most people do it prompts increased laziness in general life. And I'm very intrigued by that. I want you to tell me more about that one.
Yeah, it happens both consciously and subconsciously. So when you're proud of yourself for waking up on the cold, snowy morning and running 8 miles before most of your neighbors are awake or they're shuffling out to pick up the newspaper and head back into the warm home, what happens is you give yourself permission, you give yourself a hall pass to be lazier throughout the day. And so when you're asked, hey, do you mind raking the leaves this afternoon? You say, I'll do it tomorrow because I ran 8 miles this morning and I'm tired and lazy. So on a conscious level, you give those hall passes for another scoop of ice cream, another serving, another helping at the meal. And runners, glow and crow about how they have a free pass to eat more food. And you were mentioning the books that helped launch the running boom. One of them was The Complete Book of Running by Jim Fixx, who famously dropped dead of a heart attack at age 51, ignoring all recommendations to get medical checkups, even though he had a family history. And he would write passages like, the great thing about running is when the furnace is hot enough, anything will burn. In other words, you don't have to scrutinize your dietary choices because you're burning so many calories. And this became cultural paradigm in the 70s, and even the leading cardiovascular experts at the time, the doctors said the same thing. They thought you would be heart attack proof if you could run a marathon. And now we're seeing the opposite, a rash of heart problems in longtime extreme athletes. But back to the permissions where consciously you give yourself those hall passes, and then subconsciously the body engages in these energy conserving mechanisms to react to what's perceived as a survival threat. And so you need to conserve energy. You turn down those other dials. Remember, they are reproduction, repair, and growth in favor of excess locomotion. And I think the most extreme example, when we talk about reproduction, for males, that would mean one's libido. And for females, reproductive fitness can go awry with these extremely high-performing females when their body fat drops below a threshold and they experience amenorrhea, the loss of menstruation. So whether or not you're interested in family planning and what's happening in the immediate future, our primary biological drive to exist is to reproduce. So when one loses reproductive fitness, this is an extreme indicator that one's stress mechanisms and lifestyle are out of balance. And the elite female athletes deal with that routinely, especially in the sports that demand low body fat. So if you see a female with a six-pack, she is treading on thin ice, even though she looks great and is getting a lot of followers on her social media posts. The body does not really want to be pushed that hard, and you have to make all these concessions for general health. Yeah. And one thing I mentioned, I was pro circuit for 9 years. So I traveled around the world. I trained all day. I slept for half of my life during my career as a pro triathlete, 12 hours, 10 hours a night and 2 hours every afternoon. But I also experienced, around 5 or 6 colds every year. And it was just part of life as a pro triathlete with all that traveling and all that training. So, hey, that's 9 years times, let's say 6. I had 50 upper respiratory minor infections in my peak years of ages 20 to 30. Kind of ridiculous when you think about it, that I was bashing my immune system and suppressing it so routinely with all that stress hormone production. And on a less extreme example, that's what the recreational enthusiast is dealing with, because they have little kids that they have to get up and deal with school, and then they have to go to work and be responsible and rake the leaves, and they want to run 8 miles in the morning, and it's too much. In contrast, that sprint workout that I described fills you with energy and enthusiasm and a level appetite and satiety hormone status, so that you go through life eating healthy, nutritious meals and feeling great and having more energy because you work out and train rather than less.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Philip. I personally worked with Philip for about 8 months, and I lost a total of 33 pounds of scale weight and about 5 inches off my waist. A few things I really enjoy about working with Philip is, number one, he's really taken the time to develop a deep expertise in nutrition and also resistance training. So he has that depth if you want to go deep on the whys with Philip. But if you want to just kind of get some instruction and more practical advice and a plan on what you need to do, you can pull back and communicate at that level also. He is a lifter himself, so he's very familiar with the performance and body composition goals that most lifters have. And also Philip is trained in engineering, so he has some very efficient systems set up to make the coaching experience very easy and very efficient. And you can really track your results, and you will have real data when you're done working with Philip, and also have access to some tools likely that you can continue to use. If all that sounds interesting to you, Philip, like all good coaches, has a ton of free information out there, and really encourage you to see if he may be able to help you out. So thanks again, Philip.
Yeah, again, the parallel with lifting is, I was thinking the exact same thing when you talked about running. I used to try to train for a half marathon. I never got there. That was many years ago. I hated it. I hated the running. But yeah, you felt like, well, I just did this thing and now I'm exhausted and the rest of the day is done. And maybe I'm going to eat more too because I ran. But lifting and sprinting give you a different feeling. It, especially, with the cortisol, it helps you manage that and feel like you want to be productive. And there's also the mental resilience you get of overcoming these hard things. The costs of getting lean are very important. You just mentioned that. We've talked about that as well. And we've talked to bodybuilders about it who are like, look, it's a serious thing. Like it's an extreme, like any other sport. You have to be willing to do the trade-offs like the immune system. People don't think about that. But if you've already got metabolic adaptation happening during fat loss, now you're just going to exacerbate it with all the other stuff happening. So all great stuff. So you mentioned heart health. And I think you've talked about something called the fat max heart rate. Did I have that right in my notes? And people are thinking, again, running, heart health, zone 2. It's all the rage now, doing zone training. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's funny because I was just looking down at my notes as the one thing that's really important to cover. And you mentioned it briefly at the outset. It's sort of like, when can you get permission to run and when can it be beneficial? So it's the metabolic and stress impact of one's workout that determines whether it is supportive to long-term fitness improvement as well as longevity, or whether it can set you back. And so there's this important concept called fat max heart rate, and it represents the intensity level at which you are burning the maximum number of fat calories per minute, and that goes with a heart rate. So fat max heart rate is widely regarded as 180 minus your age is a great way to pretty accurately estimate your fat max. So I'm about to be 60 years old. So I go 180 minus 60. My fat max heart rate, my training heart rate at fat max is 120. If I were to speed up and raise my heart rate and go faster, of course, I'm going to be burning more calories the faster I go. You burn more calories sprinting than you do when jogging or walking, right? But at fat max, what happens if you envision a upside down U-shaped curve is you start burning fewer fat calories per minute in favor of a quick spike in glucose burning, as well as a quick spike in ventilation and stress hormone production and everything. So this cutoff point is so important to recognize, because if you go past fat max, the workout now becomes moderately stressful rather than energizing and restorative. So the amount of low intensity movement that one can do, there is virtually no ceiling to the benefits you accrue. So if I say, Philip, hey, let's take this summer, take a break from podcasting, and let's hike the 2,000-mile Appalachian Trail in 90 days, that would by and large be a tremendously healthy way to spend the summer. We're hiking at a comfortable pace. We're outdoors. We're getting sunlight. We're getting de-stress from mobile technology and taking breaks and having all kinds of great benefits. So there's no upper limit to the benefits of moving more. There's research from Cooper Institute about this group called super exercisers, and they studied these people that reportedly exercise 30 to 35 hours per week for decades. I'm envisioning like someone retired who walks 5 miles every morning and then walks the dog for another 30 minutes at night. Whoever these people are that can put in that much exercise, but they're super healthy and they have great longevity. Obviously, it's not extreme exercise at that level, but the active lifestyle is number one. Then what happens when you exceed fat max heart rate routinely? Then you are getting into these glucose burning workouts that are turning you into a sugar burner and a sugar chomper. You are suppressing immune function in favor of this chronic stress hormone production, and all the benefits kind of go out the window when you routinely exceed what is regarded as that cutoff between a stressful workout and a restorative workout. You mentioned all the fascination with zone 2, and it's wonderful to see this popularity now because the upper limit of zone 2 correlates with that fat max heart rate. But one contention I have with the fitness movement right now is no one's giving enough love to zone 1 and the amazing cardiovascular benefits you accrue when you're doing very comfortably paced zone 1 exercise, like getting out of the car, walking across the parking lot, sending text messages between your sets. You're still in zone 1 and you're still getting all kinds of training effect to the fat burning enzymes and energy systems in the body. Here's an important anecdote or a comparison. Eliud Kipchoge, the greatest marathon runner of all time, the guy who ran 159 in the marathon and 2 Olympic gold medals, he performs 83% of his weekly mileage in zone 1, not zone 2, zone 1. He does around 9% in zone 2 and 7% at the higher zones where he's really hitting it hard and doing these amazing track workouts. But what he's mostly doing for you and I, the direct comparison would be a medium to brisk walk. Now, for him, zone 1 is 8-minute pace per mile at high altitude for an easy 15-mile run because he's so physically conditioned.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he's running a marathon, by the way, at a pace of 4:34 per mile. So an 8-minute mile, even though it's pretty impressive to you and I, is way, way slower, 63% slower than his marathon pace. Wait a second. Take the average marathoner and slow down 63%. Guess what you're doing? You're walking and you're training just like the greatest runner of all time trains. There's the argument to emphasize walking and not worrying about having to shuffle down with this breaking stride because you're not adapted to run correctly anyway.
Yeah, I love it. 2 things come to mind there, Brad. One is recent research that confirmed again that the volume of movement, no matter the intensity, is pretty much equally effective for heart health, right? Which is what you're kind of saying. Like you can walk a ton and it's cool. And it's great for you. It also makes me think about the mode of movement and training we've been talking about, combining walking with lifting and sprinting. When you lift for 90 minutes, like that's typical for me, a 90-minute session, and I look at my Apple Watch, there are moments that I peak into zone 2 on a heavy deadlift or on, if the rest period's short or whatever. So you're going to hit zone 2, and then sprinting, you're going to hit it, of course, maybe even zone 3 or 4, because that's very short.
Yeah, but, whatever, zone 5.
Zone 5. And the percentages you mentioned actually align perfectly with that idea. Not that you have to measure it. Like, I don't even care about it, to be honest. Personally, I don't know if you do, but I just...
Not at all. No. I mean, the reason you need to care about heart rate is if you're at risk of getting into these chronic patterns. So when I was a pro triathlete, I obsessively measured my heart rate at every single workout, making sure that beeper alarm did not go off, because that is the destruction of a desired effect of the training session. And I could not get away with that stuff. And interestingly, because I was so fit back when I was a young person and racing fast, I would do a lot of my workouts in zone 1, just like Kipchoge, because zone 2 was 6-minute pace per mile. And you can't pound the body with that kind of impact, even though it feels comfortable and I'm still chit-chatting with my training partner. The training becomes too stressful. And so the fitter you get, the more time you're spending building that aerobic base correctly. But again, we have to realize that the stress is relative, such that our protocol for preparing for our modest endurance goals would be a lot of walking and then an occasional effort where you push your body hard and you have a great effort doing the weekend 10K race or whatever it is, whatever your goals are. So I don't want to blanketly trash running. It's been a part of my life forever, and I've got a lot of great benefits out of it. I have buddies from high school that are still running and enjoying it because they've been fit their whole life, and the run is like a brisk walk for most people. But we have to honor that fat max heart rate, see what that represents for us in our own workout protocol, and accordingly proceed at that pace rather than bullheadedly and doggedly assume a running pace because you think that you have to. And also what this means is the duration of the workout has to be at or below fat max heart rate, right? Mm-hmm. So as we get tired, as the workout proceeds, we have to slow down. And so you might be able to run 1 or 2 miles jogging before that heart watch beeps, and then it's going to start beeping the rest of the workout.
Fair point, because the fixed point is that heart rate, which then shifts as you get fatigued. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what a lot of people do is they say, hey, let's go and keep a 9-minute per mile pace for our 6-mile run. Well, that doesn't make any sense to the body and the brain. The brain knows intensity and the heart knows intensity. So your 9-minute pace should be 9, 9, 9:20, 9:45, 10, 10:15, whatever, because we're honoring heart rate, not blindly adhering to some pace. The only time that you should do that is in a race where you're trying to run your best time. Of course, you want to run the same split per mile. That's how records are set and personal records are set.
Yeah.
But training is entirely different than race model for most people.
Two more things I want to cover before I do. I wanted to say a nerdy thing. When you mentioned the fat max heart rate, and you said, it's in the shape of, and I thought you were going to say parabola because I'm a math guy, and you said upside down U, which is what most people would get. You're a good communicator, but
okay,
I think
parabola. That's the word I was looking for.
Oh, okay. But it's okay. You probably don't want to use it in most contexts, as people are like, "What are you talking about?" I was thinking of price optimization from economics, where you have like price
right.
versus.
I was an economics major, so now
Exactly.
I'm with you, man.
Yeah.
I remember that.
The
price optimization curve.
Yeah.
I had an instructor with a British accent. Let's investigate our price optimization curve. Oh, you can't charge too much and make more money. I see. Yeah.
Unless you want to preserve your monopoly. It's Microsoft knew back when they sold Windows 98. They sold it way cheaper than the profit maximization to keep the market,
Wow.
Anyway, so two final things, Ed. One is, let's talk about people who do love running or maybe are good at it or want to get good at it and still want to do it. And they're like, I hear you, Brad, but I still want to run. How do I do it? And then we can conclude with, how do people incorporate walking? I think those are two good places to kind of end the...
Nice. So you want permission to run. That's great. Let's first look at the propensity for an addictive approach. And we have a whole chapter in the book called The Ordeal of the Obligate Runner. And the very definition of addiction is requiring a hit or a dose in order to feel normal. So we think about the addicts on the street, they're drug addicts and they need it. They steal money and they want to go get high. Well, it's not really that they want to get high. That might have been at the start. They need to steal money and go get their drug to feel normal, to get to baseline. So if you're listening and you're wondering, am I an addict to exercise? If you feel cranky, irritable, and out of sorts, if you miss your workout on a particular day, this is a sign of addiction or an unhealthy obsession with exercise. And that's very easy to drift in that direction, especially as your goals become more refined and sophisticated, as in you get more and more immersed into endurance culture or gym culture or CrossFit culture. So we have to be very careful and realize, and I had to learn this as a high-performing athlete too, hey, look in the mirror and what are my goals? My goals are to excel in the races, and I'm making a living at this, so it's very important. It's not just a hobby. So I need to take absolute best care of my body. So I had built-in guardrails against overtraining, because if I dispersed that energy in the workout, it was costing me a chance at winning prize money in the race. So you very quickly become a really, really smart trainer when you get your ass kicked in the race because you came in a little bit tired. So those are nice protocols to have. And I'm just honoring that and sharing that with other people that look, if you're here to do a favor for your health, to promote longevity, to prevent disease, and to get the body composition of your dreams, these are all warranting a sensible approach rather than an overly stressful approach. So that permission to run, let's really ask what you're all about. And if you want to really enjoy yourself and take care of yourself, you can slow down and it's okay, and you're still getting a good workout. But that permission comes from how well you perform at fat max heart rate. Now, here's another little side note. If you're frustrated that you have to go so slow, you're allowed to do jog walks for the duration of your workout. So you can go and jog for 30 seconds and then walk it off just as your heart rate's about to climb and start beeping and ruining the intended metabolic effects of the workout. You walk for a minute or 2 or 3 or 4 minutes and then do another jog and then walk and then do another jog. So you get some running in, you get that sensation of running. That's great. The other side of the coin that you asked was, how do we get a more walking-oriented lifestyle? I think we have to make a fundamental shift in our mindset and our philosophy to put walking in a different category. It's not like a fitness option. It's really like sleep. It's a human genetic expectation for health. And when we don't move sufficiently during everyday life, we incur all manner of immediate consequences. One of them is a decline in cognitive function. The brain research, there's one study from Stanford that I mentioned in the book. you experience cognitive decline after 20 minutes of focusing on an intense peak performance cognitive task. So if you do not take a break every 20 minutes from intense work, a break will be taken for you. And I find with my tabs open on my browser, I have these high jump videos that I love watching. And I find myself watching them instead of focusing on a book manuscript or a podcast outline because I've been working for too long. Same with my afternoon nap, which I'm a huge fan of, because I know when I come back, I'm going to be kicking butt at a different level than if I were just powering through all these natural declines in cognitive function. So that's a big vote there for just sprinkling in short and longer walks throughout the day as a fundamental necessity to be at your best anyway.
You're a master at reframing this stuff. I really love this. I'm glad you came on to talk about this because just the way, think of walking as sleep. Beautiful, right? Because people are thinking they have to almost force themselves or it's their training or whatever. And I often try to talk about it in language like walking should just naturally flow from the things you enjoy doing. And let's find a way to incorporate it into your life anyway.
Yeah.
And not think of it as trying to get steps, right? Like people just think of it as trying to get steps, even though it's a good way to measure a proxy.
If that works for you, that's great. If some accountability is fine. My other favorite example is like having a dog. I'm a big dog lover. My dog of 15 years is gone now. She had a great run, but like I didn't think for a second that I wasn't motivated enough or I was too busy to get that dog out twice a day like she deserved. It's like if you're going to adopt an animal, you have a commitment, a lifelong commitment to give the animal the life it deserves. So I don't care if it's snowing or too hot or you're too busy, you get the dog out for their daily exercise and to serve something higher than yourself and your own fickle forces of like motivation and willpower, like you mentioned at the start of the show, that's a no-brainer. So I think the dog is in your corner. And how can you turn down? Look the dog in the eye and say, sorry, I'm too busy. I got a work deadline. I can't take you out for 5 minutes. Boy, that'd be tough. I could never turn my dog's face down. And then the dog has that amazing circadian programming where
Yes.
at 5:07, they know it's time to eat. And they're like, where's my bowl? It's
Yep.
after 5. You're late. Oh, I love it, man.
Yeah. We have 2 little dogs and one is really good at hopping up on your, she's so little. She hops like a foot up onto your calf. Like it's time to go out. Even if you took her out an hour before, if it's the time, it's time.
Wow.
Like it doesn't matter.
Awesome.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man, this has been fantastic. So many amazing things here about not only why to do this, but just, the sprinting and the lifting and the walking and what it means to be a human, doing hard things, but also doing things that are fulfilling for our lives, being kind of an athlete of aging is the term I've heard some people use.
Yeah.
Is there anything we didn't cover that you think is worthwhile that you wanted to bring up?
Well, I'm glad we got into sprinting because that's been my obsession of recent years. And I think it just feels so good to kind of see yourself as an actual performing athlete, where I think in endurance scene, we're just shufflers heading down the sidewalk and accumulating miles. And we're so far from, an actual athletic competition type of mentality. And even if it's not a big part of your life, I promote, with my whole message, and you land on my website and it says, pursue peak performance with passion throughout life. I think we need something to give us an edge and give us a little bit of nervousness and, trepidation that we're putting ourselves out there and we're still competing at something and pursuing goals throughout life. Because what instead we see in culture are dudes watching the NFL for 7 hours every weekend and perhaps offering up some stories about how back in the day, I was supposed to play quarterback for SC, but I banged up my shoulder at the summer practice and that was the end of my career. Yeah, whatever. Everyone's got a story and they have their heyday back in their youth. And then the rest of the time we just sit around and watch others. I think there's a better way to go through life and to pick something that's scary and challenging that you have to train for and prepare for. And that will get you out the door when things are, have a tendency to get comfortable and convenient.
So be an athlete, not a shuffler. Find an edge, compete, pursue your goal, always be improving, pick something scary, pick something challenging. Totally on board with that philosophy, my friend. And where do you want folks to look you up?
Well, we talked about Born to Walk, and we have a great website called borntowalkbook.com, where we have these bonus items when you place an order at whatever retailer you like. You come back and you can get these great PDF download resources and shopping discounts and all kinds of things. I host the Be Rad podcast. I would love to have you on someday. We can talk more about strength training and that precise approach that you communicate. So maybe that'll be a good place for people to start. And bradkearns.com, all kinds of fun stuff going on. And I'm so glad to connect with you here, and great interview. Keep up doing the great work that you're doing.
Likewise, Brad. borntowalkbook.com. Get the free bonuses. Definitely get the book. The B-Rad podcast, I'd love to be on it. So thank you for the offer. And this is a pleasure. I could talk to you for hours. And honestly, there are other topics like sprinting we could get into in the future, I'm sure. So thanks again for coming on, Brad.
Thanks a lot, Philip.